graveyard shift with the most interesting part of the conference. This is always case studies. Yay! Case studies is useful because these are South African case studies. It's not just imported from other places. And it's our people doing the work on the ground, which is very interesting. So we've got 3 big case studies for you. The first speaker will be Thomas Fuller, Achieving Net Zero from the JT Ross Property Group. This is followed by the City of Cape Town and how they are digitizing, BIMing, and thinking about that entire process. And the final case study is from the co-design, computational design team at Zutari, talking about innovation and how they are applying it in computational design. After that, those 3 sessions, we will open the floor again for Q&A. So please get your questions ready. Everything we haven't covered, we'll start with you. And then we will finish the day off and close on time. So good luck and enjoy Thomas Fuller.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much. This is like the worst session after lunch. They say, stomach full, eyes closed. So hopefully I'm entertaining enough to keep you interested. My original title for this, which I was forced to change, was, but we've always done it that way. So achieving net zero. What are the driving factors behind net zero? Now, net zero, I'm not going to go into the details of that. It's quite a quagmire of different things. It depends how you look at it, and it depends how you define it in your world and in your aspect. So we're just going to go through the high level of net zero. But basically, the principle of net zero is that you are able to offset all of your electrical consumption by not using carbon. That's the high-level theory behind it. What is driving this, particularly, are a number of reporting requirements. So I used to work for a listed property fund. I now work for a family-owned business. That's quite different. But the listed property funds in particular were required to report data on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, on the international stock exchanges, about how they were behaving and how they were performing. When you start going into the detail, you kind of realize that maybe you're not performing that well. Tenants are also now required to report on how they are and what they are operating and what spaces they are occupying in, and starting to report on a thing called a carbon footprint. How much carbon are you as a business costing the economy? Global warming is a result of too much carbon in the atmosphere, and the temperatures are going up, and they're changing, and it's affecting the world that we currently know. Some of the damage we don't yet realize, and we will probably realize over time, but what these reporting mechanisms are trying to do is change behavior. I mean, when you hear the word task force on climate-related financial disclosure, it's a bit like SARS arriving to have a small chat. ESG is driving this philosophy. And ESG, and I must say, I digress every now and again, so I do apologize, but I did a presentation to the South African Valuers Conference in Durban, and I went off about ESG, and eventually one guy about halfway through put up his hand and he says, "What does that stand for?" I said, well, that's environment, social, and governance. And in the property business, we tend to focus primarily on the environment because that is where we have our biggest impact. For you guys who are not aware, the construction industry produces about 27% of the world's carbon. Commercial property, being that across all of the myriads of tasks and platforms, produces about 80% of the world's carbon. So there's a huge focus on the impact of property on the environment. And then, of course, what does property do for social elements, upliftment, etc., employment, all of that sort of stuff, and then the governance of how we've gone about it. Have we procured land correctly? Anti-corruption, we all know about that in this country, corporate governance, risk management, and of course, tax transparency. How do we report on all of that? Well, here are further requirements for funds to report on, and this is balance sheet and income statements. These are driving most of sustainable businesses. Who was around? I may be giving away my age a little bit when Enron went under. I'm glad there's a few people at least. Enron was one of the world's biggest global blue chips. And they were performing in terms of their income statement, balance sheets, and their disclosures very, very well. And all of a sudden filed for liquidation, and there were massive losses across the London Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, and of course the effect on the global businesses, the macroeconomic impact. And one of the things that they realized is that they were not reporting their long-term liabilities or rental liabilities to the market. They weren't required to do so. So what happened? King 4 was developed, and they started to change the requirements. And this is where IFRS 16 comes in. IFRS 16 now becomes disclosure of rental obligations in your balance sheet and income statement. So it changes your ability to leverage finance. Okay? Again, you're probably wondering what the hell this has to do with BIM. I don't really know myself, but let's see where it takes us. IFRS 16 is also requiring you to now start disclosing how well the building that you are currently occupying is performing relative to other ones. I'll leave you with that thought for the moment. In a post-COVID world, it has fast-tracked tenants to focus on more closely on gross cost of occupation. What does that mean? That is your rental, plus your operational costs, plus your taxes and liabilities. How much does it cost you to put a single employee in that seat to work? I worked for Investec Bank for many years. Wonderful, and you really loved it. It cost us at that stage, around about 2006, 2007, more than 750,000 Rand a year to have one employee sitting there. The bank is 8,000 people. So understand how much money you've got to make just to put that person in their seat. In COVID, when income streams started to drop, when work from home became quite a big thing, they really started to focus in on how much is it costing me to have that employee sitting there at their desk. Is it worth me having that office space if they're not actually physically going to utilize it? Now, I'm sitting with a wonderful, tall, 26-story building you can see there, and they're saying to me, well, I only need half of it. What do you do as a listed fund? How do you make money? Perpetual income. You've got to put your contractual liabilities out there, and you are selling perpetual income to the market. It's really quite a shocking time for you. And every tenant across the board was, guys, I'm reducing space. Why? Because gross cost of occupation relative to turnover had changed. Employee experiences. Why is that important? Why would somebody want to come to the office instead of being at home? What are they getting at the office that they don't get at home? What you do realize is that you need to provide extra things that the employee is incentivized rather to come to the office than not. But also ironically, and I'm sure many of you sat on a Teams call or the Zoom call in those days, and the kid rocks up with his head. That's probably one of the big incentives to get them back to the office. There's no interference on a daily basis. An efficient utilization and functionality and operations of commercial office spaces. So how efficient are these offices? Am I paying too much relative to somebody else? And we spoke about it earlier around horse trading around different landlords and tenants. Is this particular building performing worse than other buildings? And then from a developer's perspective, the pressure's now back on them because the markets are down, limited number of tenants. We have to reduce the cost of occupation by improving the designs. We need to create more flexible office spaces. So if you had a single tenanted building and they now wanted to have a multi-tenanted building, is that space able to adapt to changes and evolutions in different tenants? If a lease comes to an end after 10 years and they move out, are you able to put 5 tenants into that building, yes or no? Looking at a building now as a changing entity on an annual, daily basis. It's a bit like my wife who goes hot and cold. Yeah. Buildings need to evolve and change, just like that. And she's really quicker. And then the improvement of the tenant experience. What are you providing that tenant with? So this is Waterfall City. This is the PwC building. It was an iconic, it makes very little money, I hate to say, but it's an iconic building in the South African commercial landscape, and that's the main purpose of it. But what does it bring? It brings infrastructure. It brings services. It brings convenience. You can walk from that building into the Mall of Africa, shop at Checkers, not having to do Checkers 60/60, and be back at your car in less than 30 minutes. Obviously, if it's a quick shop. This is not a fashion shop. This is purely groceries. Fashion is different, of course. The other things that are driving change is the environmental standards that have changed. The SANS 10400, and now they refer to it as XA. XA is an evolution in legislation from a building compliance perspective. It has now moved towards the E of ESG, where they now require certain elements to be installed in buildings. And we were talking about it earlier. When I first started building green buildings, and I did the second green building in this country, which is the Nedbank building out at Menlyn, Maine, we were then only required to have 200 kilowatts per square meter electrical consumption on the building. We got that thing through very, very clearly, and ironically, to get that 4-star rating at the point in time cost us about 2,000 to 2,500 rand a square meter, extra over that of what the SANS specification is. Now when you look at the SANS specification, a green star GBCSA 4-star building is now equivalent of SANS XA. Things have moved, things have changed. It is drawing you towards thinking more carefully about how you design and operate the building. Solar is flavor of the month, but solar does not solve your problem if your building is not operating efficiently. I always said it's like putting a plaster on a wet wound. The wound will not heal until you deal with the wound, and then you put a plaster on to protect it. Science-based targets. Who's actually seen anything about science-based targets? Knows anything about that? Ooh, okay. This is a limited in terms of that. Science-based targets are now being forced on institutions where they need to commit to the market as to what carbon-saving initiatives they are going to roll out over the next 7 years. Now, actually 6 years, till 2030, and then after that, 2050, and then after that, 2080. That we become net zero, in other words, we don't use any carbon in our operations by 2050. Businesses are required to start declaring this. And so they have to put this out into the market, that this is their commitment to the market, this is how they're going to do it, this is why they're going to do it. But ladies and gentlemen, in South Africa, we don't have a 2024 issue. Sorry, we don't have a 2030 issue, we have a 2024 issue. We don't have a stable electrical grid. We don't have consistent water. We have other things that are affecting us from a macroeconomic impact that have actually driven us already past our 2030 undertakings, because we've been forced as private property owners and developers to de-link ourselves from the master infrastructure in order to keep on operating. So we've actually already achieved the 46.2% reduction from the base date of 2019. Why? Thank you to Eskom. And South Africa, ironically, as a country, achieved its own 2030 objectives due to load shedding. Eskom produced less power. Gross cost of occupation, big focus point as we were going through. This is one of Reuter's reports, and this is basically breaking down the cost of your rental. Municipal charges making up about 70-odd%, and you can see the green line at the bottom, of your total cost of occupation. What's that? Rates and taxes, electricity, lights and water. Those fundamentals, this excludes net rental, by the way. This is just purely on costs. Municipal charges make up the most of it. How can we as developers start softening the blow of those municipal charges on our specific tenants? Now we start creating a competitive edge. We can't control, when it comes to gross cost of occupation, the rates on the rand, or your rates and taxes. You can't control that. That's given to you. Your electrical tariff and your water tariff. But what you can control are the input factors. How do you do that? You reduce your electrical consumption. Therefore, X times Y equals R times Y equals is a different number. That's how you start softening it. Ironically, has anybody seen the latest Ecoleni charges? I digress again a little bit. That's been issued for winter months. Peak Ecoleni electrical tariffs. Do you know what they are? 12 Rand a kilowatt hour. Okay. You do realize that those of you who work in the investment and development side of the business is that generators run between 8 and 10 Rand a kilowatt hour. They are charging you more than running generators to a point in time that you'll reduce your cost of occupation in your peak periods by running your generators rather than actually taking it off the grid. The cost of occupation is hugely sensitive on tenants. And we did a big analysis at Mall of Africa many years ago around, actually it wasn't even that long ago, I lose track every now and again, of electrical and gross electrical consumption relative to gross turnover. And those businesses that were starting to get north of about 15 to 20% were in trouble. How do we keep those businesses there? So if you look at a tenant who moves into Mall of Africa or into any retail business, they put a hang of a lot of money into that to get their shop up and running. When you lose that tenant, it costs you even more money to get them out and then try to put them back in again. Your job is to keep those guys in place by trying to reduce the impact of the macroeconomic cycle on their cost of occupation. Businesses are issuing environmental declarations to create a smart, safe, and sustainable community space, providing remarkable experiences in our managed hubs. Yeah? These are undertakings declared to the market. To be truly efficient, resilient, and smart in the way we plan and design and operate our portfolio, including our cities, our infrastructure, and buildings both now and into the future. One of the best definitions of sustainability I've ever come across is leave a legacy and not a footprint. Yeah? Start thinking about having the smallest impact on that environment for the future. It's not my future, I'm getting on. It's some of your student futures and your children's future that we need to start making the decisions now that makes their lives better in the future. That's what it's all about. You've set the reduction targets, and I showed you some of those things. You develop key initiatives or requirements for new and existing buildings. You investigate the feasibility of these initiatives and the impact of these initiatives on declaration, cost of occupation, reporting requirements, all of these sort of wonderful things that we've already covered. And then also implementing the selected initiatives that make sense. Yep. Not all initiatives work, ladies and gentlemen. You can't spend 1 Rand and make 80 cents. That really doesn't work. We're not the government. You need to make money and you need to put the business cases together in order to start achieving these objectives. The realization that the world is changing in front of us. Case study, first one. This is Mall of Africa. Who's been? Who enjoys it? Not that many. Okay. Anyway, well, I digress again. It was the biggest single-phase development, retail development in the Southern Hemisphere, 135,000 square meters at one time. Sandton City's bigger as a size, and so is Fourways, but they've all been built on too. So the reason why it really works quite well as an efficiency is because it was always designed to operate as one holistic element. But when we did the base build the design, and this mall is now 7 years old, the weather data told us there'd be 10 days a year above 30 degrees. They modeled it, they sized the HVAC equipment, they designed it based on the weather information that was received. 10 days per annum, exceeding 30 degrees. With the amount of air in that mall, it took 3 days to cool it, which means at the end of the day, you only had 30 days that would sit above the recommended ambient temperature, which fell well within the requirements for occupational health and safety. The actual case, 30 days a year, we were out by 300%. The weather patterns had changed over 5 years so drastically that now the mall's operation was at pressure. That mall is worth 5.6 billion rand. And now all of a sudden, guys, we've got an occupational health and safety issue. If I can say let's react quickly, it was an understatement. We had to remodel it. 30 days a year above 30. Remodeled it. Heat loads were insufficient. Heat built up in the mall. We were sitting with 90 days a year above the recommended ambient temperature. Do you want to eat food that's sitting for 90 days above the ambient temperature? It's a health and safety risk. You're a landlord, you need to react. Your food and beverages are now under pressure, and this is where they actually all sit, in the main arch of this mall. This is the ETFE system. It's an incredible system, but was under-designed for the changes in the weather patterns that we had experienced over time. How do you solve it? 11.5 million rand capex later. Non-yield enhancing, huh? This is not like I'm making money off this. We had to add an additional film, reducing the transparency by 25%. We had to add more air conditioning, and then we had to revise the specification to cope with that 30 days per annum. That's 11.5 million rand with no return. Not a great way. You can't pass that on to tenants. You can't pass that on to anybody else. We were very fortunate that we had the money available to do it, but not everybody does. Solution, build your own weather station and understand it. This is the first, and at the time our sustainability manager built this, and it rained, and all of a sudden we had water pouring into the building because she didn't worry about waterproofing and wonderful things like that. To which I turned around to her and said, listen, we've got a sustainable waterfall. Anyway, data and information. You were talking about it in your question. Data is vitally important. Information is a lot of it. Data becomes what can you utilize it for? Now you start to understand what is happening to the temperatures, what's happening to the humidity, what's happening to wind direction. We spoke about passive designs and all of these sort of things earlier. And how can you start harnessing this for your own benefit? Good judgment comes from experience, and experience, well, that comes from poor judgment. Ladies and gentlemen, the best lessons you ever learn are the hard way. I came from a corporal punishment time. Let me tell you, I got my backside snapped. I didn't mess around after that. It's a very quick message. Now you say, really, yeah. Here was a building, another case study. Wonderful tenant. They came to us with carbon declarations saying we need to reduce our carbon footprint by 50%. Existing building, existing infrastructure. How do we do it? Otherwise, we can't sign your lease because we need to declare to the market that we've reduced our consumption by our carbon declaration requirements. Let me go through the details. I'm a QS by profession, so all about the numbers for me. Facility, 4,200 square meters. The benchmark, which was the old SAN standard, 200 kilowatts per square meter. The base case, 141. So we were currently, the current building was actually operating 141 relative to 200. So it was actually operating quite well. But they say, sorry guys, we need to reduce it by 51% to meet our carbon declaration standards. And we're going, it's quite interesting. New proposed case, from 141 kilowatts per square meter to 69. Okay? The current base case, just to give you some kilowatt hours, 600,000 kilowatt hours per year. Proposed case, 307. Yeah, the one with the monkey when you're scratching his head like this. Yeah, that's what we were sitting doing. Now we go into the detail. How are we going to get that number down? We're going to spend money to get the numbers down. This wasn't about who's going to pay. This is about tenant retention. Energy efficient lighting. I can reduce by 11.5% by spending 80,000 rand. I can set my HVAC. I can add different features to my HVAC system. I can reduce the total consumption by spending 1.1 million rand. I can reduce my total consumption by 384 rand a year, reducing it by 51%. Start focusing on the low-hanging fruit of poor performing features of your building. And all of a sudden, it becomes capital allocation. And the other thing I did put on the bottom there, so I'm just going to say that there. Once you have decreased your electrical consumption, in other words, the systems that are currently operating in that building are now efficient, ladies and gentlemen, add the PV. Don't add the PV before you've done that, because PV, you want the best benefit for it. That particular return on investment was a 9.5% return on capital. Great investment as a business. But not only that, I was able to retain the tenant. Here's the base case again. The current usable, 18 Rand 35 per square meter on electrical consumption per month. Their current gross cost of occupation, 934,000, so that includes their rental. The improvements on the base case, we went from 18 Rand 35 per square meter on electrical down to 9 Rand. Okay? Reducing it from 934,000 Rand a month to 457,000 Rand a month. Okay? So, that's annualized, apologies. That is a better situation for the tenant to be in. But, from a sensitivity perspective, on the back end, for me as a landowner and operator, my rentals remain the same. My rates and taxes, there's nothing I can do about it. My utilities remain the same. The only thing I change, and they say in economics, the ceteris paribus, we change one of the variables was electricity. As a result of that, I reduced their cost of occupation by just under 9 Rand. And I reduced the total cost of occupation by 3.71% annually. What happened to that? My payback period, which is what everybody else refers to, came 2.43 years on the capital that I expended. But I had a 5-year lease. So after 2.5 years, ladies and gentlemen, that's free money that I can allocate towards something else. The valuation, which everybody seems to speak to, the value as it was at the time, 307 million. As a result, the improvements of additional cash flow that I was receiving as a business, 5.6 million. The value increased by 5% by spending less than 3.72. Great return on capital, ladies and gentlemen. Good allocation. What does this have to do with BIM? We'll get there. The other incentives that we have at the time, and they're coming to an end now, is 12B, tax incentives, where you're able to write off 28% of your capital improvements, and 12L, which sits outside of solar. So that is a whole lot of different items that fit into that. And the tax incentives then drive better improvements on return. But the biggest thing for the tenant, this is what the tenant was worried about. Their base case was the blue line, and their new case was the green one. They could now remain in that building. That building became tenantable to a global blue chip, and I will release their name. Their name was Colgate. Global blue chip were able to sustain in that building, which meant I kept the value of my building and my income. Net zero. Now we get to why BIM is important. Net zero is the new standard. What we need to do now is look at the way that these buildings are operating. I'm going to use an example, and I'm sure many of you in this room have had this one. It's a conversation with your significant other. And you want to go to a conference, and your significant other knows there's a party. Yeah? That's the main reason you're there. You go to the conference to recover, and then you party at night. So they know that. But imagine if you could now start practicing that discussion, and you get the outcomes of each scenario that you put through. And you change it each time to get your desired outcome. That'd be amazing. I mean, maybe it would be the key to the future. Why are we not doing this in construction? Why are we not doing this in buildings? We need to understand what we are currently putting into that building and how that building will physically operate in a virtual world before we put a brick in the ground. Rotation of the building, high performance glazing. What does that happen? What effect does that have on the tenant? What effect does that have on the performance of the building? And those of you who might know about EPCs as an example are coming out. But this is one of, I can't give any credit to these things. I don't know where they came from, but I just found them. Data, information becomes knowledge, becomes wisdom. So important. You take the information, you turn it into data, and you turn it into making better decisions. Hindsight is 20/20. And decisions you make up front, and this is where SANS 19650 becomes so important. You cannot move to the next phase until you've actually physically approved it. And I'm sure SANS 19650, they did cover the fact that it doesn't quite align with our fee scales. So there are a couple of little differentials that come into it, but it's an evolutionary process. But decisions you make up front save you money in the operational phase over life. Whole of life analysis of a property is now becoming fundamental, that if you spend a little bit more money up front, you save it over the useful period of that building, far greater than what their capex is. BIM is becoming fundamental, ladies and gentlemen, to the operational phase of buildings, but correct decision making that you're making now for something that happens in the future. Common data environments, you guys have covered that enough. Collaboration, it drives collaboration in infrastructure. Decision making, auditability, so important. And again, whole of life, we were discussing whole of life. Design something now in that development concept that you may be able to reuse or dispose or recycle. We have just done a project where I recycled the entire building. We crushed it. We crushed all the concrete, we used it in the layer works for G5 with a bit of a mix. We then took the portal frame and relocated it to another site, rebuilt it somewhere else, fit for its own purpose in a different cycle. It cost me 2,000 Rand to do all of that, but I could rent the building for 50 Rand a square meter. That's great return on capital. That was 33% yield. You are designing, ladies and gentlemen, to potentially disengage that building. Material banks, think about that word. A building is a material bank. It's made up of many different things. And a QS at the end of the day, imagine if I said to him, imagine if I rented the insulation and I rented the walls and the doors from people. How that would change this disposable cycle. High performance buildings, lean construction, better design up front. Ensuring that you only use as much as you have to, not more than you need to. And again, sustainable precincts and infrastructure, going back to your question, which was fantastic, well done. I'm not going to go through the importance, I'm under pressure now, but the importance of material selections and how those material selections have an impact on that physical operation of the building. Heat islands, creating heat islands, understanding reflections, understanding the impact of that particular building on what I refer to as the clients. The clients are not just me, the clients are the users and the influences. And this is now starting to get into the modeling facet, the passive design elements. Using shading to cool a building, don't use mechanical intervention. Use shading where you possibly can, and mechanical intervention becomes the active procedure to cooling the building. Only use it when you need to. Electrical consumption. So this was the second registered net zero building in the country. We were able to model it to such a point where we got our usages on the left-hand side and our PV production on the right. We were producing more than what we needed. That building has an ESCOM bill of 3,000 Rand a month for 7,500 square meters. And that's just to take account of peak demands. Not going to go through that. And again, behavior. Show people what they are doing. Nothing like, oh goodness me, I've made the mistake. But they can see the mistake. They can understand what they're doing. People that walk into that building can understand how that building is behaving. Show them the information. Information sharing is key to moving ourselves forward. It's no longer me, myself, and I. It's us. And then digital twinning. The model of building BIM into digital twins that you alleviate people, and the building itself starts to look after itself. Imagine when it can do that. And we've got to that point on many buildings where actually you have no intervention. Building management systems physically operate the building and report back to a centralized position where you can understand how 200 buildings are now performing relative to each other. And when a car engine starts to draw more petrol, ladies and gentlemen, something's going wrong. Very easy to determine it if you understand and you put the right infrastructure in place, but it's decisions you made at the beginning that roll out over time. Thank you very much.